when those primordial hands tore you from the tainted branch. I wonder, was it painful to be eaten? Or was it destiny? And did it feel like swallowing the sun? When your dark essence, like venom, rippled across creation. It's true, I eat, but am hollow. What's empty to begin with can never be full. I turn back to the wasteland and take the fruits of my burned tree. From black branches I pluck off carpal bones and rip away the fingers. I squeeze it for some essence. Nothing comes, and my bone breaks like a holy vase. By this dust I know our fruits are bones. By this dust I know our fruits are bones. By this dust I know our fruits are bones. The previous poem was The Fruit and the Wasteland by Bence Ádók. Okay, so today we have Bence Ádók to interview him. Most people know him from Substack. He's a poet and writer from Hungary. And Bence, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I mean, from born in Hungary, and live in England right now. Kind of flip-flopping between Newcastle upon Tyne, which is up in the north, explains the funny accent, and Manchester, which is where I go to university right now. I'm in first year of uni, studying English literature. It's an interesting year. Yeah, and glad to be here. Thank you, Benno.
Yeah, I'm glad to talk to you. Like I've been following your work for a while now, and wanted to invite you. Bence has a really interesting style. At the same time, he has a very he's very interested like in the classics. Part of it comes from the Bible and what I assume is like a Christian background, and but also like a lot of other places, and but with a very modern feel, almost like a cinematic quality to it in the way he manages his the images and how it flows. So how did you came into poetry?
It's actually a very random thing about how I got into poetry. See, I've been a writer, well, as close as you can get to a writer. I've been writing since I've been very little, because I started reading when I came out to England and I couldn't speak English very well. And the way I learned English was through reading these kind of fantastical, monstrous books about, bears with shark heads and stuff. And then I got hooked on, the kids stuff like Goosebumps and stuff. And I really know what to write because every time, and this has been a constant, is when I like something. So be that sport, exercise, writing, reading. If I read something, I'm instantly inspired. And I can't sit still. I can't stagnate and just be a reader. I've got to take part and create something of my own. And so for a long time, it was just stories. It was prose. I mean, I struggled to actually write anything meaningful. I mean, I know how that sounds. I mean, when you're 12, you kind of struggle to write anything that's meaningful. And then I believe for 3 years, so I think when I was 15, right up until the time when I was 18, I was working on a novel as a pastime, actually, because I've always wanted to write one, and I made a plot, like a massive, detailed plot summary, which is what I always do when I write something longer. and I just got to work on it. And for 1.5 years, I kind of wrote a little bit of it, and then I stopped for no reason. And then what happened was I got back to it, and yeah, I just had a brilliant creative spur and managed to finish it. Luckily, I've had a great experience with teachers, really, really beautiful teachers who have kind of nurtured my progress as a writer and have been giving me feedback. And so I got the novel done, and well, I wasn't happy with it. Honestly, I reread it and I hated it. And again, I know how that sounds. It's a book that you write when you're 15. It's not going to be great. It's not going to be great. And I was looking to get into poetry for a long time, very long time. In England, we have poetry is a massive part of education, especially English literature. From the time when you're 12, right up until the time when you're 18, you analyze poems and you read them and you study them. I mean, we do Shakespeare quite often in England. I mean, Pride of the Nation, and these poems that we were reading. I mean, most of them were terrible. Okay, and but there was the odd one that was so beautiful because poems are so tiny compared to a novel, which is what I was working on, and it was always something kind of incomprehensible to me. I was like, how can you achieve this amount of detail in this, maybe 10, 12 lines? And I was looking to get into it, but I was always put off with meter and rhyme, and I can't write in meter. Honestly, I'm absolutely useless. Rhyme, I can push myself. I can write rhyme every now and then, but I'd rather not. And one time, I think I told one of my teachers, I was like, I have a poem that I'd like you to read. I didn't have a poem, but I just wanted to see what his reaction was. And he said, sure, give it to me, and I'll have a read of it. And so I got to work. I was like, I've got to write something, and I kind of let loose, you know, and it was really great actually. It was one of the better creative decisions I've made in my life is to get into poetry. For a long time, I was very distant. I was, this isn't for me. This is very formal. I respect a lot of technical writers who are technicians. I respect them a lot. For example, I think as everyone knows, I'm a massive fan of William Blake. He's amongst other things, he's a massive technician of the poetic art form. I mean, he uses rhyme and meter in very interesting ways, in my opinion. And my other huge favorite, William Butler Yeats, massive favorite of him, and he's probably, and dare I say, more of a technician than Blake. I mean, Yeats is incredible with the formal elements. So I was really put off for a long time until I got into it. So wouldn't necessarily describe myself as a technician poet, but more of a battering ram. That's probably it. I love working with, as you said, I love working with images. I told my mother actually was involved in a little bit of poetry when she was younger and she was going through a hard spell. She wrote a little bit of poetry and Hungarian poetry. And Hungarian poetry is quite interesting as well because that's very technical, very formal. That's why it's really hard to translate, right? Because there's a lot of rhyme. You have to work with meter and stuff, and I mean, it's great. It's really nice when you can do that. But I always feel like I lose something when I do force myself like that.
Okay, yeah, a lot of interesting things to go from. Yeah, that's a really interesting way to transition, like from writing a novel to, which is of course like almost it tends to go like the opposite direction of what poetry does now, which is to be more condensed. And yeah, I think I also personally also was attracted to this aspect of poetry where you can like really do so much with very little, right? Like the fact that just like a couple of lines can create a lot of meaningful images or even worlds, like where something like a novel will take like 100 pages or more to do that. Like they're very different mediums, but yeah, that's interesting. And also, like, at what age did you move to England from Hungary?
So it was 11 years ago. I was 8 years old when I came out. Yeah, 8 years old. Yeah.
Okay. And what has been like the experience of like this almost like language and cultural change for you, and how do you view that in terms of like your creative work?
So that's a really deep question, to go off of. It's hard because when I was in Hungary, we were very badly off. We were struggling financially. It was during a time of recession, and my father came out first to England, and then my mother followed, and then me and my brother came. And I mean, when you're like 8 years old, you don't really know like all the cultural stuff, the heritage that you lose in Hungary. But then I never viewed it as a sort of thing that made me less, in the sense that like I know a lot of writers, for example, of poetry and prose who see themselves, in my opinion, as sort of less for being. And I've also never really quite gotten with that idea also that I'm behind because I am foreign and I had to learn a different language. English is actually one of the easiest languages to learn. And it's crazy because Hungarian, on the other hand, is one of the hardest. I mean, Hungarian is really interesting because it's, I mean, it's Eastern European. We've got, even my name, for example, and you've probably seen it on Substack, it's got the accents on the A and the O. So that's kind of like the type of stuff that you see in Slovakia, and other countries like so. But then we also have Turkic letters also. And it's this kind of weird mixture, right? Because no one knows where Hungarians are originally from. There's a few theories, but no one really knows. And that's something actually that I've really started to get back into. So as I said, I've never viewed myself as less or being behind these other people because I had to learn a foreign language. I like the challenge that I admit that, naturally when you come out and you can't speak language, you are behind. But I never viewed it that way. I like the challenge. And it was quite tough. Obviously, you get put into primary school and, people are like speaking English to you and you can't respond because your brain is thinking in Hungarian, and you know like how to say cheese in English and like very few words. So you can't respond. But it's interesting English because I can't actually write meaningful poetry or prose in Hungarian, which is something I would say is the biggest loss. Cultural wise, I'm actually a massive participator in maintaining and sustaining the Hungarian spirit within myself. My mother and my father are very proud Hungarians. My brother, he's his own character. He's no doubt just as much of a passionate Hungarian as I am. However, I really like to go deep on the history. I mean, I've even got a few cultural artifacts in my home from Hungary because I'm sort of obsessed. So when it comes to writing, it's a massive part. As a matter of fact, I'm doing some research right now because I've got, in my opinion, I'm trying to step up my game. So I'm really deep diving into research, and one of the main things I'm doing is looking at folklore. Now, luckily, Hungary had this really beautiful children's show called Hungarian Folk Tales. It's world renowned, and it's got millions of views on YouTube. There's like 108 episodes or something. And what I do is I just sit down now, with this kind of a perspective that I have as, I suppose, an artist, dare I say, and just analyze these recurring images, these really weird images that come up. It's like one of the main images that come up is the skinning of a wolf. That's really interesting to me. Like, what do these things mean? In the culture of Hungary, what does that mean? and then how can I translate that? And that's, as I said, I'm a massive fan of Yeats. I'm a massive fan of Yeats because he was trying to do a similar thing. And Yeats is an interesting guy because he grew up in England, but then went back to Ireland, almost doing the reverse of what I did. And what he did, he couldn't speak, Gaelic, and he couldn't speak, I suppose, Aboriginal Irish, and what he did was he wrote poetry about the myths surrounding Ireland, and I think that's and he actually kickstarted, an Irish literary revival. I mean, you can disagree or agree with his politics. I personally don't tend to go into politics. I mean, maybe we can go into that later on about my distaste for the political. But when it comes to Yeats, he's a massive role model as to how I can achieve something like that. There's so many great poets in Hungary who write about myth, and they do it in really interesting ways, actually. And I've obviously tried to explore it with some of my poems. Who knows to what effect?
No, definitely, it's something that comes across in your work. I think you've done already some poems that deal with like Hungarian mythical figures. And would you say that like that moving into England and learning a new language and probably like a new perspective, did that help you in a way to take more seriously your background, your roots in this sense, like as a way to stay connected or to or even just sometimes it even helps, like this is like a common thing sometimes referred to when people travel, that it allows you to have like a new perspective on your own country and culture, right? So was this something that you think helped you in a way to almost access that cultural aspect?
I think so, because it makes me it makes my perspective interesting, right? Because now it's like I'm almost a hybrid, if you'd like to put it like that, because I can put myself in the Hungarian perspective and look at these myths and folklore from the Hungarian perspective. I have understanding of that, but then I have understanding of the outsider's perspective, and that's really important. Always, for whatever you write, is consider the outsider. So, for example, as you mentioned, I write amongst Hungarian cultural folk poems and literature. I write Christian literature, but it's important for me also to consider the outsider. You know, that's a really interesting question. Yeah, I would agree it did help because, as I've said, it helps me to kind of jump between these two perspectives. It's like I understand these stories. It's like subconsciously, spiritually, I understand these stories. They ring true to me. I don't know why, but they just do. And I suppose that's folklore. They just do if you're from that part of the country, or place where the folklore stems from. That's a magical thing in itself. But then I can also look at it from this outsider's perspective and think, as I said before, this idea of the skinning of a wolf. Like, why is that something that's so relevant? Why does it pop up so many times in folklore? What could that mean?
Yeah, it's a very important aspect that I don't think a lot of people realize now as part of poetical work, that this myth, that this cultural myths and I'll want to go also into the religion soon, but that the myth aspect of was mostly maintained by poets, and this association of metaphors that become ingrained in culture, right? Like in a way to as a cultural almost language, and not many people, even though we have figures like Yeats, who was very concerned about kind of like reviving that role of the poet, that traditional role of the poet, in as a maintainer of myth, of fairy tales, all these other really important cultural artifacts, really. And I'm assuming you're like Orthodox Christian.
Actually, no, this is gonna be a surprise, I think, for a lot of people. I'm Protestant.
Oh,
Um, yeah.
interesting. And is that from your family or?
Yeah, so it's quite interesting because so my family is somewhat religious. I've learned I think they would consider themselves spiritual, but they would consider themselves 100% blown out Christian. Um, in my opinion, they are. Whether they consider themselves, it's a strange question. But then again, it's like Christianity is so interesting in Eastern Europe because you'll go out to Eastern Europe, let's say from England, and as a Christian, you'll have an understanding of what the church system looks like and practices look like. But when you go into the countryside, that's where it gets really weird because then it's like that cultural national identity and those myths that may be a little bit pagan do tend to mix with the Christian. So that happens a lot in Hungary. For example, like my grandmother, when I talk to my grandmother, happens all the time. For example, the stars, for example, even this kind of reverence for trees that stems from Hungarian pagan myth. But I'm Protestant because I started going to a Protestant church in Hungary. In Hungary, they call it Reformed churches, and of course, they don't really say Protestant when they say Continental Reformed because it sounds more deluxe and it sounds more cool. I don't know. There might be more of a reason. I just don't know. But I'm Protestant, so I've gone to church since I was little. But then I came out to England, and there was like quite a long time when I didn't go to church because I couldn't speak English that well. So I wouldn't have understood the sermons or the hymns at all. And it was 2 years ago when I was 16 when I started really getting back into it. And I think why a lot of people would think that I am Orthodox is because I write a lot about Orthodox Christianity, and I have quite a close affinity with Orthodox Christianity. I have nothing to do with them. I've never met them, but I read about them and what they believe in, and I find it really interesting. At the moment, actually, I'm in a bit of a, I wouldn't say crisis. It's just I have little debates within myself whether I think this is right or not. This happened the first time I went back to church. For a few weeks, I thought this church is the right place for me, and then I've been reading my Bibles from Genesis to the end. I'm on Book of Matthew now in the New Testament. Only reached the New Testament 12 days ago, but I've been reading it every day, and obviously when you read more you understand more, and I always like to bring my own perspective to the Bible. That's why I'm not the biggest fan of Bible study. A lot of people have been wanting me to go in my church. I haven't yet, because I do like my personal closeness with my Bible. And what happens is sometimes I just get these ideas, my own ideas about how I should view, some of the parables in the Bible, some of the lessons, some of the laws. I would say that I'm quite strict. I mean, I hope a lot of people would agree that I keep quite strictly to the laws, and I've been reading a lot about Orthodox Christianity, and I love certain aspects of it, but certain aspects I haven't yet agreed with. So who knows? Maybe I'll eventually convert to Orthodox Christianity, but it's not happened yet. And I don't think it will happen soon, but it might eventually, unless something else comes up and I convince myself that Protestantism is the right way.
Okay, that's very interesting. Yeah, because I'm not sure. Like, is the Protestant Christianity big in Hungary?
Yeah, that's I was going to get onto, but I kind of forgot it because I ramble. But what's interesting is that Hungary is surrounded by Poland, Catholic, really strict Catholic. Romania is Orthodox. And you've got, surrounding countries like Serbia and Slovakia and, all those other countries which tend to fall in either Catholic or Orthodox. Hungary is continental reform. It's reformed. So it's Protestant, actually. And the majority of the country is Protestant, but it's different Protestant than what you get in Western Europe.
That's very interesting. I didn't know that. And so would you say that at 16, it was basically more of a personal decision to go back into Christianity?
Well, I've been thinking about that because people ask me all the time, about my spiritual journey, and it's interesting because I tend to locate it on this one event, which it's nothing cataclysmic. It's not like I survived a car crash and thanks be to God, nothing terrible has happened to me that made me find my faith again. But it was something really menial. I think someone asked me because I prayed every night. It was a lousy prayer, I'll dare say. It was a kind of a request and deliver kind of prayer. Just give me this. I would like this to happen. And I think one day, and I hadn't been reading my Bible for a long time. I mean, obviously, when you're like in the youth groups and the toddler groups in church, you don't really like get to the nitty gritty of the Bible. I didn't really know anything about my faith. Is what was scary. So one day, I think someone asked me something about something to do with the Bible, and I just couldn't answer. And I felt so ashamed of myself. I want to disappear. I want to sink into the ground and just melt in shame, because I essentially I just got exposed as a fraud. That's what happened. I was like, I know nothing about the religion that I claim to follow. I'm disgusted with myself. And a couple of weeks after I started reading up about it, and then I was like, probably the best thing to do would be to go back to church. And the staple of when I really started to take it seriously again is, interestingly, again, as a Protestant, I got a rosary bead, which I wear all the time. And I use it to pray, actually, especially during Lent today. So, I'm quite a weird hybrid of Christianity. And I got this rosary bead. And after that, I was just like, I'm committed. I'm fully committing myself to this because I believe now. And it got to the point where I didn't realize how much I would commit myself to this. Like I had a job at the time. It was a lousy job, and it was nothing to keep. But it came down to a choice between staying with this job or going to church, because I was working on Sundays, and kindly asked my manager, could I not work on Sundays? And she said, "You're not even Christian. Stop lying." So I felt pretty bad. So I was like, okay, I'll leave because I want to go back to church. And when I initially started going to church, I went to this pretty small church, and I started disagreeing with some of the views that the priests held and that the church was propagating. So I left. So I'm kind of I suppose a hard-headed person in that, when I think something, I don't necessarily think I'm right, but I'm going to pursue it until someone, presumably my elder, although not all the time, as life has shown me, tells me whether this is right or wrong. I put a lot of faith in people that are my elders, in the sense that in Hungary there's this belief that the older a person is, so for example, I have an older brother, he should be a role model for the younger brother, who is me. And it goes like this. So, the father should be a role model for the kids, and then the grandfather should be a role model for the father. But then even in society, if you meet someone, let's say, who's older than you, and they start maybe lecturing you and telling you of certain things and secrets that they've learned, you're expected to listen. And I respect that a lot. I respect the role of the elder a lot, actually. But I haven't had really a spiritual elder in my life to tell me what's good and what's wrong. So I've kind of been following my own lead for a while, and God's, because I've been praying for guidance often. And and at the time, after I left my initial church, I didn't have a church to go to, and at school I ended up talking with this kid who's 1 year younger than me, and it was one of those conversations that were just fated to happen. It had to happen. And I'm sure maybe you've had this before, Benno, but you just sit down and you talk to someone about, let's say, art or your craft or your religion. And you ask them, what do you do in this situation? What do you believe we should do when this and this happens? And this kid, who's a year younger than me, 2 years younger than me, sorry, just had all the answers. And after that conversation, I felt quite ashamed because I'm this kid's elder, and I'm bringing. I wouldn't say, I'm always quite extreme with my beliefs about myself, but essentially I left that conversation. I thought, I'm bringing shame to my religion. I need to be more like what this kid is. And this kid was a really great role model for what I should be like. So I really thank God for setting up that conversation. And yeah, I've realized I've gone quite off rails with the topic of conversation.
It's okay, and I mention it because, or like I try to go into it because you describe yourself almost like a Christian writer, or very interested. Like I think in your bios, like you have like I'm gonna bring like a Christian literature back, right?
Yeah.
So,
so
well, so yeah, so how did like this religious resurgence like start mixing with your artistic endeavors?
Interestingly, I hadn't read anything spiritual before I came on Substack, and I'd been following Ian Katner for quite a bit, and his I suppose sermon about the writing literary renaissance rung really true to me. And I thought, this is great. This is exactly what I want to be part of. I want to be a part of this when it happens. And I was eagerly anticipating when it's going to come out. But at that time, I was quite deep into my spiritual resurgence. And at that point, I was kind of what you would probably describe as what a Christian is, a conventional Christian, and how you would expect a Christian to behave. I'm, of course, never that happy with myself. I always think, I should be doing this and this and this better. There's always room for improvement. But I came on the writing school that Ian Kanak had originally set up. And I just thought, I've got to find my niche. There's a lot of great people here, and how am I going to stand out? What's going to be my thing that no one else is going to be doing? And I was thinking, and I was like, I'm so deep in my faith and my belief in God now. I think it's time to really go out there and bring back Christian literature. Because I haven't finished the book. I hadn't finished the book at that time for 5 years. It's very bad. I read Blood Meridian, I think, when I was 13, maybe 14. And after that, I couldn't finish anything. Like Blood Meridian was that thing which put everything out of reach. And I was very, very unhappy with the state of literature. I think there wasn't anything meaningful. And I asked myself, what's meaningful to me? The first thing that just came to me was, Christianity. And then I realized, spiritually, this is the right thing to do because I can write from the spirit now that I'm going to write about Christianity. However, my conception of Christian literature is very different to the conventional conception of literature. And so I brought this niche about, and it was great. It was like one of those things. It was like those light bulb eureka moments where I just said, "This is going to be great. I'm going to do this. I will bring back Christian literature." And that's why in my Substack I say that I will and not that I hope to, because at this point I'm obsessed. I'm in an obsession right now with doing this and making it happen. Not necessarily for me, but I want to put meaningful stuff out there. And meaningful for me is Christianity. And I mean, of course, not all of my work is Christian, but I have a really deep kind of concern and issue and interest in the spirit. But I love a good dichotomy. So when I care about the spirit, I also care about the flesh. And I think you will have noticed this in my writing is the two tend to interlink quite often and merge even. But then again, so yeah, I think school, I mean, and the literary renaissance, what I call revolution, um, helped to bring it about because I didn't really have faith that I could write good Christian literature. But then I just said, I have a conception of what good literature is, and I've got a conception of who God is, and and what Christianity is about. Let me mix these two together, and I'm going to create something magical. Is what I was hoping for. I wouldn't say I'm there yet, but we're on the right track, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think you've done like a really good job in like making in giving life to a lot of Christian concepts in a way that feels still very relatable outside of like just like a necessarily like a purely Christian milieu, right? Like that somebody who like could be like even an atheist or whatever else and still find it like resonant or powerful in a way. So do you think like for it sounds like for you it's almost become like do you see like this as a part of like your spiritual practice or work in yourself?
It's interesting. I wouldn't qualify my poetry as a spiritual work. But what I do think is happening is prayer. And my reading of the Bible has been really turned upside down and in a good way. Because now and I've always taken this kind of view that, the Bible is infallible and what happens in it, in my opinion, and, if you disagree, that's I'm not here to convince you. I'm no evangelical. And so when I read the Bible now, I see still the message, the main message, but then I also see these little images that stick. So, and it's always, there's a pattern of images that do stick. So for example, it's never really the kind of pristine and beautiful images from the Bible that stick. It's more so these kind of dirty, gruesome images that stick. So for example, like my favorite book from the Bible is Book of Judges. And for me, it's one of the darker books in the Bible, in my opinion. A lot of bad things happen in that book, but I love it so much because there's so much darkness there to explore. And when you do that, of course, spiritually, it's almost like bringing a light into the darkness. But that's also what interests me about hesychasm. And I've wrote a poem about the hesychast, inspired by this kind of prompt on Right Conscious's Substack. So shout out to him for making that happen. But that's really interesting to me because I wouldn't necessarily consider myself a hesychast, although I've been attempting out hesychasm for quite a while. And it's turned itself around. So I wouldn't say the writing itself is spiritual work, but the writing has influenced my spiritual work. So that's interesting because you would think it would happen the other way around. But nothing tends to happen for some reason that way for me.
Okay. And it might be like a good transition to also talk about like Blood Meridian, because it seems to me like reading that at 13 must have been like quite an experience. How did you come into Blood Meridian?
So the other thing that I write, apart from books and poems, is screenplays. And at the time, just before I was reading Blood Meridian, I was going to write my first screenplay because I love movies. and I love writing. So I was thought, let's combine the two. And I was going to write this really violent kind of Western, neo-Western actually. And I was like, I don't really know how to write violence. I want to read a book that deals with violence so I can see how the art of violence is written about. This is me when I was at 13 or 14. And then I just looked up, what's the most violent book I've written? And, lo and behold, it's Blood Meridian. And I read it. It didn't have the expected impact. So it didn't actually help at all with the screenplay. But after I read it at 13, I understood 35% of it, let's say. That might be generous. I understood maybe 30% of it. But I got to the end and I was like, oh my, this is insane, I have to read this again. So I've read Blood Meridian 5 times since then. I've wrote an essay about it one time for one of my assignments in 2 years ago, which was pretty good fun. It's always nice to see the look on your teacher's face when you write about Blood Meridian, especially when you're still in high school. And so yeah, I came across Blood Meridian because I wanted to write about violence, but then it changed my entire perspective on literature around. And I haven't found anything. Well, the only meaningful thing I've read since then is pretty much the Bible and this massive collection of the complete works of William Blake, which I'm reading right now.
Okay. So like two things, because it seems like it was like a very important event. Like what did you take away in terms of violence? Because you said like it didn't really find anything, or even might have subverted what you thought violence was. So like how did Blood Meridian transform the way you think about violence?
So I always thought of violence when I was writing it as this kind of pulpy thing. It's almost like Tarantino-esque thing that's in there, and it's it's shocking, so let's have violence that's as shocking as possible. But I never really understood how you could use violence repetitively to one, desensitize the audience, but then also to create meaning. Because for me, violence in film and literature, before I read Blood Meridian, was always pretty useless, and it was just kind of there because it's shocking. I'm a massive horror fan, so I'd read a lot of horror, and violence was always just there, and it's like yes, it's shocking. But then I read Blood Meridian, and this violence seems innately spiritual. Again, I know it's vague, but it seems like the violence here is being used to explore something, and that was what was really revolutionary for me. Which I know it's pretty surface level, but when I was 13, it kind of gave me this new perspective that okay, so when I write violence, it doesn't just have to be surface level meaningless. It can mean something. And so, for example, the main thing that sticks to me in Blood Meridian, apart from the Mennonite, whose favorite character out of the book, but the Tree of Dead Babies, for example, really stuck to me because I was kind of racking my mind as to what could this image mean? I mean, is this meaningless? I mean, it isn't, because this is Cormac McCarthy, so there's got to be a reason this is in there. But it's a violence and it's got meaning. And that's interesting to me because, and since then, I mean, I suppose you could describe my works as violent, which is another thing why some people would be surprised that I write Christian literature. But my Christian literature is violent, and it's aggressive. But then also about how McCarthy sustains the violence and the level of depravity in the book, and yet the end still shocks you. Why is that? What kind of is that? Is that like a psychological trick that he's pulling? So that put me in a different perspective. The ending kind of because I at the time I read Blood Meridian quite slowly, as you would when you're 13. But what was happening was I was reading it and I was thinking, okay, so the violence actually means something. This is crazy. I mean, naturally you become desensitized to it. and it's, okay, it's not a decapitation, it's not a scalping. But then you get to the end and it still shocks you. But that's just violence also. So why does it shock you? And that's one of those things which is, and I love it when a novel or any piece of literature is incomprehensible. Like it can't be explained. I can't explain why Blood Meridian's ending forced me to read it 5 times again, but it just did. And I still don't have the answer as to why the ending still shocks you, even though the violence is maintained at this extreme level. It's a filthy amount of violence that's maintained throughout the whole novel, and this single act of depravity at the end, well, implied depravity, it's still just as shocking as it would have been if it was at the start. That's masterful, and that's something that I took away from it, and that's something that broadened my horizons on violence.
Yeah, like Blood Meridian is like a really, really interesting book. It's of course another book I've kind of really studied, and part of the interesting things is that it almost is like two books at once. There's like this like superficial narrative, which seems like just like mindless violence, but just by the way he uses language, which is very poetical, and it starts like revealing underneath it like yeah, a very transcendental or almost metaphysical reality, which is really masterfully done. And that, like, to me, like, at least I like that the ending part of like the what makes it really interesting and like impactful is that throughout the novel you get, of course, no like violence is always really detailed and explicit, but like the final scene is not, you know, it's what you would call obscene, which comes from etymologically from out of the scene. It's not shown, it's not represented, right? So he chooses like this final moment to create like an incredible contrast to the rest of the book. And so this is why Blood Meridian can be a hard book to understand, because it's mostly done through very subtle like linguistic effects, right? Like and most of the like the really profound meanings that it has almost always occur in this kind of like subversive way. So yeah, and you know, like a lot of people have tried to also describe it almost as a Christian book, which I would not necessarily say it is, but like I think part of this can also tie a little bit to Christian art in general, which can, like, at least in like American tends to be like kind of like this really cheesy, soapy, almost like a saccharine art, you know, like or music, like Christian rock. It's what most people would assume, and yet like the main symbol of Christianity is like a violent one. Like it's a posture towards violence, right? Like it's the cross, the crucifix, right, which is like one of the most violent acts, you know, like in Western roots or culture, right? Like it's as much violence as a man could endure, and it's like a posture towards that. So like it like violence is very central to the culture of Christianism in that sense. And I think that's what sometimes gets lost in a lot of like in, I guess, like in Christian literature or in other representations, which tend to focus more on or try to make it this really sanitized thing. So I don't know, do you have comments on this contrast or Christian art or literature in specific?
The main thing that I would have to say is that, as I said before, my conception of Christian literature is very different. And I agree with what you said about that kind of, as I said before, I'm not an evangelical. I think evangelicals are born and they're chosen. I don't think I am an evangelical. Therefore, I don't preach in my. I suppose I would be able to convert someone if I tried, but even then, it wouldn't be through rational means. Um, so my conception of what Christian literature is actually opposed to all the stuff that you've just said, and I think that's why. And some people who aren't Christian are still a big fan of my work. The biggest pointer I had was when Josh Datko told me that he loved my poem Lent. He wouldn't classify himself as a Christian, but it's still rung to him. And I mean, I suppose if you have the time and you go to read my poem on Lent, it's quite different. It's not an exaltation. I mean, I suppose it may be, but I wouldn't describe it as something that's merry. Doesn't mean I think negatively about Lent. I think very positively about Lent. But there, and I'm using that as an example about how I think about Christian literature in general. For me, my Christian literature is very different because I don't want to convert. Well, if you get converted as a means by my poetry, then that's fine. That's a plus. But I'm not bringing back a Christian literature that's aiming to preach. I think most people have heard it all now. There's better people that can preach than me. I can't preach as well as some people out there. I'm going to leave that to all those other people. My conception of a Christian literature is actually, it's very oblique. I want to show you the world without God. I want to show you the world of the flesh. Then I want to give you a hint, like a little bit of a glimpse of the world of the spirit. And then I want to, oppose almost, I want to make those two clash. So I think I'm not saying Christian literature that preaches is bad. I wouldn't, it's not my style. I wouldn't be able to do it. My style actually comes from this one ghazal, and all of my poetry can be traced back to this one ghazal written by this brilliant poet called Agha Shahid Ali. And he wrote this ghazal. It's my favorite poem of all time, called Tonight. It is the singularly most beautiful poem that I've ever read. I read it every day. It's so beautiful. As a matter of fact, because it's a ghazal and it uses the tonight as that refrain at the end of the lines, I cannot use tonight in my poetry without thinking of that poem. Getting back on topic, that poem really showed me how I can write about the spirit and the flesh. Because that poem, if you have the time, I would urge you to read it. Pause the podcast and go and read it. But
well, or maybe you can read it right now if you have it.
Wow, let me put it up. Let me put it up. This is and I think you'll be able to see. Can I screenshot this one?
Yeah, I think it's on share, like share screen. No, wait, but if not,
doesn't matter. I'll read it out. I'll read it out. So it begins with this quote from Lawrence Hope. Pale hands I loved beside the Shalimon. Then the poem itself. Where are you now? Who lies beneath your spell tonight? Whom else from rapture's road will you expel tonight? Those fabrics of cashmere to make me beautiful, trinket to gem, me to adorn, how tell tonight? I beg for haven, prisons, let open your gates. A refugee from belief seeks a cell tonight. God's vintage loneliness has turned to vinegar. All the archangels, their wings frozen, fell tonight. Lord, cried out the idols, don't let us be broken. Only we can convert the infidel tonight. Mughal ceilings, let your mirrored convexities multiply me at once under your spell tonight. He's freed some fire from ice in pity for heaven. He's left open for God the doors of hell tonight. In the heart's veined temple, all statues have been smashed. No priest in saffrons left to toll its knell tonight. God, limit these punishments. There's still judgment day. I'm a mere sinner. I'm no infidel tonight. Executioners near the woman at the window. Damn you, Elijah. I'll bless Jezebel tonight. The hunt is over, and I hear the call to prayer fade into that of the wounded gazelle tonight. My rivals for your love, you've invited them all. This is mere insult. This is no farewell tonight. And I, Shaheed, only am escaped to tell thee, God sobs in my arms. Call me Ishmael tonight. That is the poem, which helped me find my style. And I read this, and my conception of what a religious poem can be was inverted completely. I got back to the drawing board and I said, this is what we are working with. This is the style, and this is the voice that I want to work with. I would say my voice, perhaps, I'll leave the audience to tell me this, is a little bit more aggressive than Shaheed's. But I think it's such a beautiful poem because it talks about belief, and it talks about the strain between believing and not believing. And it's a fight. It's a fight to get through this poem. There's a lot of allusions. There's violence. There's wounding. There's blessing. There's cursing. There's damnation. There's salvation. All of the things that I work with are in this poem. And this in itself is what I think a Christian literature that's going to thrive in this age and time period is going to have to do. I think it can't be all, roses and poppies. I think it has to be dirty. I think it has to be quite mean even. So yeah, that would probably what I would have to say about the difference between my Christian art and Christian art in general. I'm not sure. Would you agree?
I think there can be like space for other forms, but like definitely something that is really important nonetheless is the fact that, as you mentioned, like not to preach through art, because otherwise, it becomes then basically propaganda, which is like a blanket term, and like a and there could be like different ways of apologetics, that could like you could find like a kinder term, but like in art in general, there's like almost like a part of it why it's so effective. It's because you're not entering into this like manipulation of the other. You're just like showing something that hopefully is alive, and if that is done right, then it becomes something that can be valuable and can really transform, even if it doesn't convince us like in a rational way, right? Like hopefully, like there can be like things that you can find, for like beautiful and still helpful personally, even if you choose to be from another religion, right? Like and this is something that I think it's important, right? Like these aspects that that you could still admire, like in the beautiful churches, like in the architecture, and get a sense of the divine without necessarily accessing that through something that is rational and which you might reject in a way, right? So and in terms of like I think like some of the aspects of like the like terms of like I think, well, or to transition a little bit, like I think like poetry since most of the people learn basically just what they teach them at school, and they're exposed to mostly like very uh sometimes bad poetry, mostly like love poetry and very like emotional and like kind of like sappy poetry. They get like a really narrow conception of what poetry can be, right? Like, and I think that's why sometimes showing more other facets, right? Like more violent, more crude aspects can sometimes be more effective for people to change their preconceived notions of what poetry can be, right? Like because yeah, poetry is almost like a dirty word, right? Like if you say like I'm a poet or I do poetry, you know, like a lot of people would think that you're like prancing in the flowers, just like thinking about birds and stuff like that, and this very narrow view of it, which you know, like I do a lot of nature poetry, you know, like it doesn't, you know, like there's place to do those kind of things, you know, but like I think most people have like this really narrow view of what things can be, right? Like and and mostly poetry is in a sense like a trying to get people unstuck from the ways they're using language, right? Like because a lot of the ways we use everyday speech, so a lot of those things actually come from poetry, right? And then become cliches, and they can be they get stuck, right? Like so, like the poet almost needs to reinvent language constantly so that people can escape the those preconceived notions they have of everything, right? Like so I think that is an important aspect of the power that like poetry can have, not only like for you in your case personal, like in like for Christianity, right? Like changing the preconceived notions they have of it, like through like uh, modern portrayals of it, or you know like or in movies or whatever, you know, but like but I think it expands further than that, and well, maybe to transition a little bit, I think like in like as you mentioned before, like cinema is also some like a part of culture that has also influenced you a lot, and I think there's like an aspect of that in your poetry too, that like certain dynamism and the way you use images. So would you care to talk about that, like the relationship of like cinema and like poetry?
100%. I think it's very important to move between dynamics, different dynamics. I think cinema and writing mixes so beautifully well. I think your cinema sonnets that you've done with Rasmus Rosenkranz has beautifully shown that. I mean, it's a really nice gateway into finding inspiration. The way I accessed it is my dad is a massive movie fan, and that kind of hooked me onto it as well. And there's certain things that cinema can do that poetry can't do, but then there's certain things poetry can't do that cinema can't do. And I think a lot of people forget about the second part, right? So, for example, there are certain poems, longer poems, like narrative poems, I think that would just be impossible, wouldn't work on a cinema screen. But then there's certain movies that just won't work on paper. Um, I, for example, have a keen interest in filmmaking. I've made a few short films, you know, throwaway stuff. But what pulls me in to cinema is images, and I love a beautifully shot film. Not all the time. That's not the main component of what makes a film good for me. But if I can latch onto certain images, I love it because it hangs in my mind. And I think with my poetry, it's really important for me to work on images. I think a couple months ago, I was having a conversation with my mother about the kind of poetry I'm writing and why I don't use meter and why I don't use rhyme or why I don't use rhyme often. and I start talking about how, because I write about internal things, internal dynamics that go on within, not so much on the outside, but the things that go on within, I think, need to be reflected in, and that's as far as I go with formal structure and technical stuff, is kind of looking at how, if I'm going to be writing out stuff that's internal and happening within, I want things happening within the lines of my poetry. That's why I love alliteration over rhyme. I think it works much better, in my opinion. Um, but I also like alliteration because I can really manipulate some of the images that I'm working with. So, for example, if I'm writing about a flower, all it takes is a couple of, clever uses of alliteration, and I've suddenly destroyed your conception of a flower, just as you would on a screen, in my opinion. You can manipulate images on a screen in any manner you want. It's the same thing in poetry. I think that's really important. And because and the main thing is that I work with in poetry is images. I always have certain images that are flowing around in my head. Music's a massive part of it also. But cinema inspired me to draw images out and put them into the poem, and then make those images stand out, and then dissect certain images and pull them out in really irrational ways. I'm a massive fan of irrationality. I don't like the rational, which is again why I don't write Christian poetry or literature that preaches or is an apologetics even, because I can't, this whole thing about, proving God's existence through science and maths and those things I have zero interest in, because for me it's all about this kind of, if you like to call it subconscious, I would even say sub-spiritual process that works under the lines of the poetry, within the poems, and within the images of the poems. I think cinema does the same. A good film will do the same, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, it's one thing that is really useful about studying other mediums, artistic mediums, is that it really shows you what you can take and what not. Like there can be like certain things about cinema that can inspire to almost try to replicate them in poetry, and that can give you access to new techniques, but also figuring out what can be done in poetry that cannot be done in other mediums, as you mentioned, right? Yeah, it gives you you start developing like an artistic intuition about techniques and how you can achieve things through different ways and different mediums, and yeah, and what can be considered essential aspects of art in a way. And personally, to me, that it's helped. I like to do some music, I like to do other stuff, and it's really interesting to find that kind of artistic creativity and seeing and manifested in different ways, right? So that sometimes can give you access into different approaches, right? If you, of course, music and poetry is are very close together, right? So developing a sense of rhythm, right? Through music can then help, and it can help you then to achieve similar things in poetry, and so on, right? I think I've gone on this in in other interviews and stuff, but I think people sometimes miss today the opportunities that you can have in doing multi-medium things, or having like a disciplinary like collaborations or just like talks, right? Like this was something that was more common before. Like you would have like, for example, like Rilke, I think, like went and studied, well, not necessarily studied per se, but like he spent a lot of time with Rodin, right? Like the sculptor, right? He's like and from that like sense of like just like inherent artistic sensibilities, you can get a lot, like and it happened also like with like Picasso, like he would do things for the theater, and then they would bring like Coco Chanel and she would do like the dressings, and then you would have like Jean Cocteau do like the play or something. Like I think all of those things were very enriching, right? Like, so that's why I try to make a lot of emphasis like on ways to try to get that back, right? Like, and to try to bring more of that cross pollination across different mediums, right? So yeah, I don't know. Like I think we've gone through a lot of subjects, right? Like, do you want? Is there one that you want to bring up? Like,
Yeah, I mean, I was always interested in personally your outlook on this idea of the Renaissance, of the literary Renaissance. I've got my own thoughts about it, and wanting to, as I've said, I've become very much enamored isn't a strong enough word, I'd suppose. Become quite obsessed with the whole idea, not just my own kind of spiritual Christian revival of literature, but I think the Renaissance and well, I say revolution because oftentimes you look about and it just kind of it seems like all hope is lost, but then if you do your research, you'll go on like YouTube and you look at the people who are reviewing books. It's young people, right? I mean, it'll be people slightly older than me, and then you'll read another article which is poetry's back in vogue, working with that idea, especially poetry's back in the trend. Like I know it's not exactly the poetry that me or you would possibly be fans of, but do you think amidst the apparent hopelessness and chaos, where do you kind of excavate that hope from for a better tomorrow for literature?
well, that's an interesting question. Like in a sense, I don't really care that much about the idea of like necessarily creating like a better world per se. Like it's more of for me, like mostly it's like a personal calling, and something I have to do as a way of self-development almost. So that's for me like the most important aspect, right? Like I think we like part of the problem of our current culture, I think, is this constant anxiety about the state of the world and trying to save the world and try to create like a better place, when for me, and that has led mostly towards forgetting about becoming like better people, or like a personal development, spiritual development, right? Like I think that can sometimes be like especially manifest like in politics, like I think personally that's why I don't really care that much about those aspects, because it kind of subverts what for me is like the true purpose of life, which is like this personal growth and spiritual development, right? Like and then you start just like focusing on the outside. That being said, like it's I like when I talk about like personal things, that doesn't mean like the personal is separated from like your environment, right? Like and your society and your family and other aspects. So like it usually your own development will be tied to the ways you try to also bring that forth outside, right? Like I think it's just a matter of not becoming obsessed with like fixing the world in a sense, right? Like because that will I don't like, for my personal views, you know, like and maybe this can be shared like in Christianity, right? Like Christianity has like a very pessimistic endpoint for the world, right? Like it's like depending on maybe on traditions, but like at least in like more, perhaps more the Catholic, I think like it's like the apocalypse is coming, like the devil will reign over earth, like earth is ultimately gonna fall, right? Like there's no sense in like necessarily worrying about that, but it's more about how you personally deal with that, and no matter the age you're living it, right? Like you always have the opportunity to make something worth out of it. So in that sense, like personally, like it's like a personal thing, but I also think that poetry, art in general, is still what is necessary to bring more balance and more yeah, just like the best way you can actually create a cultural change and a change in people, right? Um, uh, like just so it doesn't necessarily sound so big. It's just like it's more of a perspective of not necessarily doing things based on getting necessarily like the fruits of it, like this idea that is like expressing the Bhagavad Gita, right? Like it's, you have to do things in a sense no matter the outcome, right? So that's my, I would guess that's the subtlety with which I view like these things. Like it's something that I carry as a personal mission, like but I'm not like I don't cling to a specific outcome necessarily, right? Like I'm not I'm not necessarily focused on like on this like utopic idea of a society, right? Like it's just yeah, it's just a basic aspect of of bringing that development and those visions into society, right? Like and yeah, and then it becomes more or less a providence of how it changes it or not, right? Like it, you can have the best intention sometimes with the things you write, and maybe society might as well, you know, do with it like what it pleases, right? Like for example, like with Nietzsche, you know, like who's like one of the most egregious examples of like everyone wants to use him for his own goals, right? Like and even things he openly was against, right? Like even like he was like very opposed to like Aryanism and the Nazis, and like he even wrote that his worst nightmares was that like when he died, like his sister would like do something well that it would be misinterpreted, like so he almost had like this really fascinating prophetic notion that like that he would be like misused in a sense, right? Like so not to say that necessarily like Nietzsche had like the, you know, like necessarily like a very like pure, like overtly pure intention to with his work, right? Like to achieve something really positive, but you know, it's just like this notion that you have to kind of do the work no matter, I guess, the outcome of it.
Yeah, so that's interesting because I always thought of more like a spiritual change and maybe even a psychological change that needs to happen in order to, you know, bring some of the guys, you know, that are on Substack here, and some of the girls as well, that are producing, you know, incredibly consciousness broadening things. But I think that's also something as well, because you know, at the same time, it's like, you know, you are kind of the product of your culture, and where you are. So, you know, monkey see, monkey do, you know. So you try and change. I think that's an interesting way of looking at it, because I always thought, because see, I've got a massive bone to pick with the what I call the coward writer, which is the coward writer. You know, it's not necessarily someone who's afraid to take risks, but it's someone who, and I think it's really important for you, well, for any writer, for me, it's important to have that one thing, which is like an obsession. So, for example, you know, Christianity and would be there, you know, amidst my writing. That would be my obsession. Outside of writing, you know, it's probably the Renaissance and bringing that back. But what I'm trying to get here at, I suppose, is you know, do you think maybe the cultural change do you think can be brought about, and then possibly, you know, a spiritual and psychological change within? Or is there no process, you know? Or because I don't really think of this as rationally as I'm making it out to be. I always think, you know, and that's why I love this Renaissance. When I started writing, I always wanted to be part of a group. To be honest, you know, I'd looked at these, for example, the Romantics. You know, the Romantics, you know, they're great because it's like, you know, you have all these geniuses that are living more or less at the same time, and they're reading each other's work, and then they're almost playing off of each other's work, and it becomes a conversation in intellect, in this incredible intellect. And that's what's interesting to me about the Renaissance. Why I love it so much is because it's so, and in the best way possible, it's almost got no like foundation and no rule set. That's why I think it's great, because as you said, like, for me and you are talking here, I love your work. I suppose you're a fan of mine. However, our conceptions of bringing about change is different. So, in my opinion, that would be one of the main assets of a movement like this, to bring about change. And if that's, you know, what we are trying to do, I suppose, is just let everyone have their own voice, and then, you know, have those voices working. You know, is that something that you would possibly agree with, or do you think better like a more structured, like kind of movement, almost like a manifesto? Does that work better?
Yeah, I don't know, like and maybe I sounded a little bit vague because I don't necessarily want to go too deep into my own metaphysics, but like just to, I guess, to clarify, like in the sense of like like my view of it is like the world and reality is here for to save us in a sense, and not the other way around, right? So in that, from that point of view, like I'm sort of like somewhat of a pessimist in terms of the world, but not necessarily like a nihilist, in the sense that I don't think that there can be no change. It's just that I don't think that I don't think the earth is meant to be like a utopia or like a paradise, right? Like it's meant more as a growth tool for humans, right? Like, and in that sense, like I still participate in it. I don't think like doing anything is futile. It's just that a lot of the things are out of our control, right? Like you can like like I still have like my personal ideas, and I do think that I can bring change in others, and like through art, you know, like, but that's not necessarily up to me, right? Like there's almost like a sense of providence in how your work will be received and the role it'll have like in society, right? Like, which is kind of why I brought up like Nietzsche and stuff like that. You never really know how things will be taken, right? Like, so from that point of view, it has to come from more of like I think from like it has to come more from like like a pure sense of a calling that does not depend necessarily on achieving something concrete, right? Like I'll still do this even if nobody, even if it doesn't, creates a big change in society, or doesn't solve the problems I think I would like it to solve, right? Um, I think that comes also from I think from a point that is important, I think, for a lot of artists to understand that there's a value in doing art that is like a personal spiritual calling that does that that can be independent from achieving like success in the areas, whether that's like the very base economical or fame aspects, or the more higher call, or the more higher objectives of maybe transforming society or culture, right? Like there are forces that are very interesting outside of your own personal capacities, right? Like uh, like in the case of Kafka, right? It wasn't through his own necessarily ability of being like a really good writer that he acquired that place in our culture, but more through, you know, just that his body decided not to burn his stuff, right? Like there's all this interesting aspects of how art becomes relevant, which also is important to talk about right now, right? Of course, like the production of art is very important, but also the other side, right? Like as a critic or a writer, or the academic aspects, which are also have also kind of like deteriorated. That's also something that has to be built again, right? Like this learning to appreciate art and like trying to promote it, and or just like Ian's doing, just like this basic interest in reading books, right? Just like trying to make people interested in art, because it's not like art is that, it's more like the culture is kind of dead. People are no longer really interested in art anymore, and so there's also that aspect that is very relevant, right? To how do you make people interested in it again, so yeah, just to wrap it up before we start going like too many tangents, but yeah, that's, I guess that would be like the subtlety, right? Like that which I view, I guess, this movement, which is like in a sense, like I would probably, at one level, I would probably be aligned with this, with a lot of these aspects, right? Like of trying to bring back a sense of the spiritual, of poetry, of the transcendental to people, but with the caveat that I think it's also important to understand that you should work without really caring about the consequences in a way.
So that's interesting as well, about kind of that spiritual and the transcendental. That's something I care deeply about myself. And they're like often a question that like I ask myself is like my own stance. I'd love to know your stance on the rational against the irrational. And by rational, of course, I mean, something that's grounded in the logic of the earth. I don't necessarily think irrational has to mean it's logicless. I think irrational still has a logic, but it's just the logic that's alien. That's why I think that's another thing why I think Blood Meridian works so well. When I was reading through someone's analysis of it, someone said Blood Meridian reads like these scalp hunters are going through an alien world, and there's that whole thing about the it's those I'm not very good at astrology, but those astrological houses. The seventh house is death and that kind of thing. but and I like that idea because blood meridian works with a different logic. It still has a logic, but that's why. But the reason it's strange is because it's an alien logic. So I think irrationality is something more to do with that kind of, as you said, that transcendent. I mean, two questions here maybe. Do you think the transcendental can have a logic? Do you think the spiritual can have a logic? And in my opinion, I kind of oppose the rational in the sense that I don't like the kind of the rules that the earth abides by. That's why I always look to, I suppose I look outward, why my publication is called The Great Beyond. I mean, it's called that beyond other things, amongst other things. But that, I mean, yeah, that's something I'm not, I won't necessarily say I'm 100% decided on is does rationality, possibly the logic of the real world, of the reality you inhabit, is that something you think that needs to be eradicated to bring about the transcendental? And do you think the transcendental can have a logic?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like my personal views are very centered in what you could call like traditional philosophy. So it's a lot based in terms of the elements and maybe what I have developed as in a way as a tied to like an astrological view of humans, right? Like so in this conception, like you have like the four elements and you have like water, you got fire, you got earth, you got air, right? Like and these are all metaphors of different ways of manifestation in human life, right? So you have the rational elements, which would be like air and earth, but you also have passional elements, emotional elements like fire and water. And part of the problem is that in our culture, we mostly only consider the rational elements, and that creates like an imbalance, right? So like the complexity of the human being is that he's made of almost like these opposed parts between itself, right? Like in a way, yeah, like the rational will be opposed to the emotions in a way, but doesn't mean that they cannot be balanced, right? Which is what you want. And we right now we don't have a sense of balance. We think only the rational works and that only rationality brings like positive effects and the rest should be kind of like discarded. So in that sense, I don't think that logic should be done away. It just needs to be brought into balance, right? Like and in a sense, you do need to accept those irrational aspects of yourself, and yeah, the transcendental will have like a certain aspect that has to also go beyond these levels of being of the basic rationality, but there is over it like a sort of understanding that is way deeper, that you could call the understanding at a soul level, right? Like because a lot of things are not with some things we do not really follow based on, it's impossible to follow everything based on logic alone. Like if you live, the problem of living like one of these aspects of yourself and completely focusing on it is that they all they're none of them are sufficient by themselves. They are all kind of self-contradictory by themselves in a way, right? So they need to be complemented with other aspects in order to function correctly. And this can be like viewed in terms of like the dichotomy between like faith and like reason, right? Like a lot of people will criticize religion for taking things based on faith, but that's just like an essential aspect of being a human being. Like even like the most like rational person has to have some things that he believes in faith. For example, they will have like the belief that only the rational, can be good, right? Like in mathematics, is just the way you need to, even the way you need to structure it is based on like fundamental truths, which are called axioms, and you cannot really get away from that part. That's kind of like the foundation, and from there you can start like going up through reason. So it's just important that people learn to kind of broaden beyond their inherent like biases that we have, right? Like for somebody who's only rational, he'll really struggle with those other sides of himself or herself, to accept like the emotional aspects, both in terms of like, it could be like empathy, but it can also be like things like passion, right? Like desires and stuff like that. So yeah, it's the aspect that makes life, and from that extension also culture, complicated, because we tend to only value certain zones of ourselves, right? Like in this case, like rationality, and from that point of view, yeah, like a lot of what we have to do is kind of make people be comfortable again by stepping outside of rationality, which doesn't mean necessarily to abandon it, but to know that there are other parts of yourself that you must also like develop in order to be balanced, in order to grow, because even if you only focus on rationality, it'll start like eating itself up, which is kind of like the stage we're at, where people are starting to even stop being rational from this oversaturation of information, right? Like, so it's even it even works against itself when you take it far enough.
I think that's a really nice way of looking at it, actually. It's a different way of how I've looked at it. As I've said, I'm in flux right now. I'm reading a lot, so I'm getting all sorts of information fed into my brain right now. But another thing which is really important to me, and I wonder if this is maybe something that's not as important to you, and if it isn't as important to you, outside of, we've talked about cinema and we've talked about music, we've touched on music, but for me, for example, history is really important, but history in the sense that, picking up something really small, so the smallest thing possible, so possibly even something like a singular fossil. Not that I'm interested in fossils, but let's say looking at a fossil and then, looking at the history of said fossil, analyzing it and stuff. But then, because of course history is always, and possibly the fossil metaphor isn't the best for this, but let's say a war, or a siege in history, and reading up about it really, really much, like a lot, and then you have to make a judgment. And I think that about history is a great tool for the writer. I think it's brilliant, especially if there's something really specific which you want to look at. So for example, me, I'm really interested in the Huns, and who they were. There's not a lot on them, but and it's really mysterious. So that works really well for me because I've got to make a judgment. So I've had to make a judgment about, descendants of the Huns or not, as a Hungarian. But then again, I think history gets misused in that, what you said, in this kind of this rational way about thinking, okay, well, these are people that, we've got to trust, and I can't even bring my own opinion onto this because I wasn't there, they were there. But then, of course, history is always stained by bias. And I think a lot of people misuse history by just reading up about the information, but then not doing anything with the information. So I'm wondering, you know, if is history something that's possibly an important tool for your writing? I know it's a massive tool for my writing, but is it something that you think you weaponize in your writing? And if it is, when you are, you know, collecting information and looking at history, I mean, I know my stance is obviously that you've got to make you have to bring yourself into that space and bring a sort of judgment into that, whether you think yes or no. You know, for example, what I've done is I've been reading up about who are the Huns, where they come from, could they be related to Hungarians? And a lot of people say no, but then there's a lot of people that say, you know, a nomadic tribe, you know, who never settled in one place. So you can't say no because it's just impossible. So I've made I suppose I've taken all the information, but then I've made this kind of decision based on purely just my psychological process after collecting this information of what I think myself. You know, is that possibly something that you do, or do you not favor history as a tool for your writing?
Okay, yeah, that's like an interesting question. Like, I think we also have like a very complex relationship with time right now, like that is very almost pathological in some ways, with this like notion of the progressive view of history and time, where we think that things are always getting better, right? Like, and the future is always going to be better and like more with more progress, etc., and that we're more evolved in a way than before. And I think this leads to a sort of like a disdain and a false confidence with the notions that we have from the past. And where personally, I think that in many ways, like the past is as mysterious as the future, right? And from that point of view, I'm also really interested in ways that kind of are able to bring that sense of mystery and maybe even reverence towards the past, right? Like that makes people understand that that every moment had value in ways that could be really astounding for us, right? Like and I think that's really important, especially in art and poetry, because we almost like, especially I guess in poetry, it's very clear that we almost have like an anti progressive history, right? Like the Iliad, the Odyssey, like the Bible. These are works of art that we didn't just like continue growing in quality from them. That they are already at the peak of human capacity, right? Like our cultural history already starts like at a peak, right? Like and things might have, you know, there can be works that are able to rise again up to those heights, but not really surpass that in that sense. So like from there, I think it gives a really important tool to understand that that those people were as sophisticated, if not more, you know, like than us, right? Like and even before they like, for example, in the time of Newton, they still almost had like the reverse sense of history, that the past had was really the golden age, and from then we have just been like slowly deteriorating. They had like this notion of like the prisca sapientia, which was like the golden perfect knowledge of the ancients, right? Like that they had like a perfect understanding. And from there you get like I guess like the myth of like Hermes, like Trismegistus, right? Like, and the Hermetic text, you know, that they believe to be like evidence of this like perfect ancient knowledge. So in that sense, like I think it's really important for poets, especially today, to be mindful of the tradition that they're following, because we focus based on this kind of like notion of progress in like the way like culture has advanced, where we try to um, concentrate on just breaking away from the past, breaking all the rules, um, like getting rid of every tradition. That it's really important for artists, especially, to reconnect with that, and learn how to um, use it in a way that it gives back the roots, right? Like because you need to have it's impossible to like the direction that they took of just like wanting to focus only like on originality and be even ever more kind of like shocking and breaking more rules, led to a completely sterile uh, artistic environment, where it really using the metaphor, it completely took off all the roots. So and it's something that really doesn't make sense, like as poets, you work with language, which is something that is both communal, like shared, and also historical, right? Like you need to know where the words come from, right? Like it's not only in a sense of like certain like trends and like historical works of art, but also the words themselves. You need to kind of understand like how they have grown and evolved, right? Like that's also part of like the work of a poet, to really know also the history, like the roots, like the etymological roots of things, and figure out, like, go back to the Latin, go back to the Greek, go back to the Old Norse. All these things are really relevant in order to work with these are our tools, words themselves as poets, right? Like and specifically as poets, maybe in fiction you could say you work with more like with sentences more than really with words, but like the poet is the word itself. You need to know the effect it has based on sound, how it has changed, what were its original meanings. All of these things are combined to give you the potency to your work, right? So that's some of my ideas around.
Yeah, I mean it's a difficult sort of concept to answer, straight up. I mean, I haven't got. I mean, there's problems with what I think also, because when you do what I sometimes do is, you kind of have to make a judgment call about whether you think this is, what you believe in. I think that's faith also again, but then again, that can also go wrong with, bringing too much of yourself into the history, and that there's a danger of falling into that. But like, interesting what you said about poetry, working with words, and prose fiction, working with sentences. I mean, my love for both is, you can't draw a line between them. I love them both equally. And what I'm really interested in is almost this synthesis, and whether it is truly possible to synthesize poetry and prose. Because as you said, with poetry, you work smaller scale, and potentially, unless you are writing the Iliad, Iliad scale poems, then I guess you would be working on a similar scale. But because you are, and I 100% agree, you work with words in poetry, and those words, as in my kind of creative process, you use like those small words to create these, sometimes, in my opinion, for my work anyway, jarring images, stuff that maybe destroys your concept of certain events, certain things. And prose is of course different, because it's almost like a behemoth, like you can get lost in detail quite easily. But is because I know there's prose poetry that exists, and I know that's thing, but is it even possible to truly synthesize poetry and prose? Because as you pointed out, they are quite different, with words and and sentences. It seems really minor, but when you really come down to it, the gap, it's almost like an abyss, and because is it something possibly like the alchemical philosopher's stone, which is possibly, I mean, who knows, possibly unattainable, but it's still something you yearn for, and you try in vain, or do you think it is truly possible to fuse poetry and prose? Because it is one of those things which I try and I wouldn't 100% say perfect, but it's one of those things when I do write prose, I do try and write it as poetry, but then I get stuck with what you said about the scale. I mean, I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Mhm. Well, yeah, it just depends, I guess, on what you would consider to be like a fully a full synthesis of both, right? Because I think Blood Meridian, for example, is a perfect example of that mixture. Like for me, it really, like the first time I read it, I actually didn't like it that much. Because I mostly was expecting a novel, and really the book doesn't work as a novel. It really, to understand it, you really have to read it like almost like a like poetry. Like for me, it's like a poetical epic, right? Like and after I got deeper into poetry and I started reading the book again, like I immediately got that subtext, like and loved the book. Like I finished it and like almost began reading it again, like so I think that's like a perfect example of somebody who's used both really well, and in terms of that it both works as prose, but it's also using a lot of poetical techniques, and that's why it almost has a sense of like having like two different narratives going on simultaneously. What it's being told like by the prose, and what it's being told almost by poetical means. And like I think personally, it's also something I try to do in prose. Um, and I think it's something I really like experimenting with. So in that sense, I would say that it's definitely possible. But like it just depends on what your notions would be of what a perfect mixture of the two would look like. A lot of things, like even though they're kind of poetry, like Paradise Lost, are almost like more working towards what we consider now like fiction, or like a novel. Like so yeah, in that sense, like it's possible, in and it just becomes a matter of like that you can never really define them precisely enough to like kind of like assure like what is like a perfect mixture, I would say.
It's a certainly an optimistic outlook. I suppose it's more optimistic than mine. I always look at that kind of, well, I look at Blood Meridian, for example, as that kind of thing that's unattainable, almost that kind of level of writing. And I suppose it is, because no one will write identically to Cormac McCarthy, especially now that he's dead. And it's about how close can you get to that level within your own style, which is quite interesting. And I'm wondering, you yourself, and you're a poet, and you, as you've pointed out, and as I know, you kind of experiment with different dynamics, but you also experiment with different poems. You've got your haikus, um, nature poetry, and then the stuff I really love, the indescribable stuff. Which I don't want to put a label on it, because I feel like it would do it a disservice. What I'm really thinking of is like your latest poem about Cain, um, that kind of poetry. Do you think, in order to master, your own, not necessarily poetic, but as a writer, your voice, is it important, you think, to not get bogged down in, because I'm certainly working on different, so for example, I know I'm talking about bringing back Christian literature, but in order to bring that about, I'm also really interested in impressionism, and I'm really interested in, I suppose, more of the folklore aspect, which, you know, I guess sometimes you would consider pagan. I wouldn't, especially. But do you think in order to find, not necessarily find, but master that voice, do you think it is important for you to not get bogged down on a single area that you focus on? And it's important, for example, like you yourself or me, to branch out from your main, concept or focus into different areas? Or do you think, is it better to, put all the work on one simple focus?
I guess in that question, I think it might also depend a lot on a specific types of personality. Probably, I think there might be people who can develop a lot just by focusing on one thing, and personally, I really enjoy figuring out like a lot of different techniques and doing a lot of experiments, because but like I can admit that is also like something that aligns to how I am basically. But I think it's always good to as a writer or any kind of artist, I think it's always good to, have a very serious study of things that you like and enjoy, whether that's very specific or very broad, right? But doing it in a more serious way, right? Like I think for poets that sometimes, like people have lost that sense of like studying like the more kind of technical aspects, right? Like just like I don't know, going to Shakespeare and check how he uses meter and how he uses grammar and syntax and all these things, and or do the same with like Latin poetry, right? Like and try to learn new languages and see how the original sounds, how the language works, right? All these things I think are really important for poets. I think with the notion of like free verse and the poetry sometimes associated with like having the freedom to express yourself, and any type of kind of thing that smacks of more rigid endeavor seems to be counterproductive to it. But it truly isn't. Like even just like with like things like formal poetry and sonnets and like the distinction between like free verse and this, it's mostly based on like on wrong ideas, right? Like most of the times that I've gone into trying to do like formal constrained poetry, like I found like amazing like sprouts of creativity, like having those rules and constraints like actually pushes further your creativity into areas that might even be unknown to you. Like I made like a series of poems using only one vowel, for example, and that was like a really cool experiment, because like some of the poems were like brought things out of myself that kind of surprised me, that you didn't know you had in you. Whereas if you sometimes only focus on things like free verse, it's easier to get caught up on your kind of like safe zone, right? Like in where you're always kind of just following or advancing through your own biases or preconceived notions or like biases, etc. Right? So I think it's really important for poets to kind of experiment a little bit more and do more kind of these exercises, right? Like I think it's very helpful, right? Like I think most other artists, like kind of have that for granted, right? Like if you're a musician, you spend a lot of time learning to play other people's songs, and like there's no question about like the technical necessities and and I guess imitation practices. But like in poetry, because of this notion of like free verse and like these wrong ideas around it, I think a lot of people have forgotten of how important and how useful and how fun even it can be, right? So that, I guess that would be my take.
Fair enough. Because that's obviously what I'm trying to do, and I think it helps because I think it almost works in a cumulative way. How like you said, the more things you're exposed to, it brings out those kind of, like with your vowel poem, it brought out those things that you wouldn't have otherwise thought of. It's that sometimes happens to me when I force myself to write in a rhyme scheme. I end up working around the rhyme scheme, but then some of the stuff that I write is, you know, it's extraordinary, not in the sense that it's really good, but it's out of the ordinary. It's beyond the ordinary. Um, so yeah, I mean, unless you've got any more questions for me, I've picked your brain long enough, I think.
It's been great. I think I'm also satisfied with all the different areas we've been through. So yeah, like for everybody, I think most of the listeners right now know who you are, but like it's Bence Ádók, and he writes The Great Beyond on Substack. I don't know if you want to like promote any other social media or people or place where people could find you.
Unfortunately, I mean, you can find me on Instagram, but I don't post anything on Instagram. But yeah, I mean, it's pretty much on Substack. I'm maybe inevitably I'll branch out, maybe. But I do like the Substack pace. I think it works really well, especially for the stuff me and Benno are doing. I think it's perfect for what we are doing. So unless I get some brilliant idea to maybe start a YouTube channel, which isn't going to happen soon, but if it does, I'll let you guys know.
Yeah, like Substack really is good enough. The only problem is like yeah, you like right now, yeah, you need to have some form of thing like YouTube or other to like kind of funnel back, right? Like that's a little bit of the idea, because other than that, like Substack allows you to publish more or less anything by now, video, like audio. So that has allowed for a lot of richer publications and stuff. But anyways, I'm really glad to have talked to you. I'm sure like people have also enjoyed like learning, like about your whole process, which is very interesting. I think you have a very particular and yeah, interesting way of how you approached eventually art. Just like from Blood Meridian at 13, and
That just seems edgy, in my opinion. More than anything.
well, like it's for me, it's not even because of how violent or that aspect. It's just such a hard book to go through. That at 13, like even if I was in a very morbid mood, like at 13, I don't think I would have, like had the interest to go on with it. But anyways,
yeah, I mean, if I may add, I mean, I'm really pleased. First of all, to be on a podcast, my first time on a podcast. Better yet, be on Benno's podcast. I'm really happy, especially because I'm sure, as you guys could have told, I kind of flipped the interviewee status there for a hot minute or maybe more, because I think Benno is one of the most intelligent people I've ever. I mean, I always go on these book clubs, and when my man Benno's there, I'm listening. But then after I come off the call, and it's like oh my goodness, you know, like I need to read more is essentially what I come away with, and it's what I've come away with in this podcast, but in a good way. This is naturally not in an envious way. I'm very happy for the success that Ben has got, because actually the first time you liked one of my poems, I remember exactly which one it is. It's a poem called Concrete Visitations, and you left me a comment. So obviously I went over to your page to check you out, and at that point your I think your publication was Saturn's Funhouse, I believe. And I read your work and I was like, this guy is doing exactly what I do. Well, not exactly, but similar to what I do, but just maybe 100 times better. Incredible poet, incredible writer, and clearly a very good interviewer. I mean, he's somehow extracted an hour and more sort of information out of me. So I'm blessed to have been here, and I'm blessed that all of you people who are watching have stayed until the end to listen to me. So thank all of you guys. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Yeah, it's been a really cool conversation. Yeah, we almost had like a half and half time to interview each other. So
had to pick your brain, Benno. Had to pick your brain. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but yeah, I love having these talks. You know, like I think it's really important to. One part of the things I like is just getting to know a lot of people who are invested in poetry, and I think what you're one of the most remarkable examples just by the dedication you've shown to your work, right? Like you've been constantly publishing almost like almost every day sometimes, right? So his work ethic and his ideals are admirable. So I'm really glad that I had you on. I'm sure a lot of people enjoyed the conversation, and hopefully we can have another chat soon.
Of course, anytime. You know where to find me.
Thanks, Bence. It's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure as well.